Okay, I'm going to go ahead and let people in, but we'll wait a couple of minutes to get
Okay.
started. Does that sound good?
Hmm.
Hello, everyone. We're just going to wait for a couple of minutes for people to roll in, and then we'll get started. Thank you so much for being here. Lauren, I'm going to go ahead and hand over to you the hosting. All right, I think we'll still have people rolling in, but why don't we go ahead and get started? I want to thank you all for being here and participating in the conversation. My name is Dr. Michelle Harwell, and this I don't even know if we should call this a program. I think the reason why I situated it as a conversation is I think that my sense of being here on the edge of the fires, there's been such a need and reach for others and connection and trying to locate ourselves, and what's happening and bear the overwhelm, the feelings, the devastation. And I think that's been coupled with a sense of realizing how many of my colleagues, even ones who've lost their homes, who are dealing with the anxiety and displacement, um, practicing, in this parallel process, not unknown to us in what we lived through in COVID, but I think a different kind of devastation and anxiety that honestly, when I kind of created this space, there was a feeling of just um, immediacy. I think not wanting to put too much didactic thought into what this is going to be, but more responding to, I think, the emotional need and holding and bearing of experience. So, in that way, I feel pretty vulnerable to this process and tender, and I think in an important way that I think wakes us to the moment that we're living in. Um, so that's some of the impetus. I'm hoping that this space will cultivate a sense of connection, a little bit of relational home with our colleagues, and help us to find some language for the tectonic shifts of emotion and experience we've all been walking through. I want to just make a couple of notes. We are recording this experience, so just for your own, sharing. If you want to share your experience or ask questions, just know that it is being recorded. And I also recognize we're on hollow ground that needs a respect for the acute nature of this disaster. And I think the various impacts, that we all have a different location and positionality and vulnerabilities, and it's fresh and tender. Um, so I also wanted to say something out front that we're going to have. So the structure of our program is going to be about 45 minutes of conversation between George and Peter and I. And then we're going to open up for 45 minutes of just discussion and process. That can be questions, that can be experience, but I want to encourage you to be kind of thinking on that and also welcoming what kind of dilemmas or idiosyncratic experiences are you bumping up against in bearing this parallel grief. And one more. My hope is that there will be some ways in which we become more aware of our needs. And by that, I mean, what kind of holding structures, or is there a need for more conversation or small groups? I'm part of an organization, the International Association for Psychoanalytic Self-Psychology, and they have generously offered to follow up this this program with more support services. And what we wanted to do was see kind of what emerged from the conversation. So we'll be following up with more specific supports as we kind of listen to the conversation today. So with that, I wanted to introduce you all to Dr. George Bermudez and Dr. Peter Maduro, both who are training and supervising analysts at ICP, but with different distinctions. Peter Peter offering a kind of what we call intersubjective systems theory and a deep sensitivity to, I think, trauma work. And that's part of the texture of what I wanted to bring in his voice. And George Bermudez really bringing an aspect of community psychoanalysis and social dreaming as a part of his expertise and repertoire. So George and Peter, I'd like to start by just asking you each, but maybe we could start with George, what compelled you to be a part of this conversation? I know, George, when I reached out to you, I thought we were in a similar location in the sense we both live in Pasadena, and I knew your house had been affected, similar to mine. But my house was intact. So when I reached out to you, I had not known that your house had burned. And what was surprising to me was in not knowing that, and your response was so expansive and generous. It was really touching, and I think an example of the generosity that can show up in the vulnerability we experience. But I wanted to just give you an opportunity to talk about what compelled you to be a part of this.
Yeah, it's like extraordinary. Well, colleagues have been asking me, and that involves also patients. So I was really able to return to my clinical practice online. One of the few things that I rescue was my laptop with my entire life is in. It's extraordinary. We left with very few things. We are still slowly grieving many of those things. So this has organized me, helped me maintain cohesion as extraordinary. So colleagues will ask, aren't you sort of getting miffed or tired of people asking you what the experience was like? And my response is, no, it actually organizes me. And what I've experienced is extraordinary resonance, and I feel such gratitude for the outpouring of help, both financial resource and just the openness and availability of people to listen and hear. I first became aware that my home was destroyed on very early Wednesday morning by actually eyeballing it. We had voluntarily evacuated Tuesday evening very early. Really eternally grateful to my wife's extraordinary vigilance. I was teaching at around 6:45 in the evening, and we lost all power, including cell phone power. It's pitch dark. She knocked on the door and said, "We have to leave." And we gathered a few things and fled. We fled to my daughter's home in LA. And I was so deeply concerned. Against their wishes, I said, I'm going to leave early in the morning, pre-dawn, and see what's left of the house. If it's intact, I'm going to rush in and get some things. Believe me, I'll be safe. They, of course, were sobbing and worried and wanted to keep me. I drove up the hill and I saw my entire community. I felt like I had been thrust into just a disaster film. All the homes that I was familiar with in furious flames. I'm about to turn the corner into the block where our house is situated, and I realized I would really be putting my life in danger. I quickly turned around and I called my wife and I just began to sob. And I said, "It's gone. It's just gone." Um, it's an extraordinary then series of events. Our family came together. It felt like we were prepared because of COVID. We had built a certain kind of cohesion and coordination. And we were able to hang together, call friends, and I am now situated in this marvelous context of the generosity of friends in Santa Barbara, where I've been able to think, feel, plan, and deal with the next steps of recovery and rebuild. Our community is extraordinarily coming together. The Altadena community has developed a system of zone captains where there will be people organizing sections of Altadena, contacting all the residents and organizing a coordinated response. There are folks throughout California who are sadly experts because they've been through this multiple times in California history. So they've started an organization called After the Fire, and they are available for consultation and guidance throughout this entire process. So I feel so held. So part of my motivation is to continue that feeling of being held, but also to share and to give back and to enhance that. Many of you know of my work in social dreaming. So it feels like an opportunity to also give back and to pay forward everything I've gotten in my life and career. Yeah. And something, Peter, you had said in our pre-meet in terms of what I call the valence that we each of us has individually because of our own trauma histories. I grew up in New York. I grew up in a cherished neighborhood in Spanish Harlem, which I saw devastated at a certain point in my development. And I've always then held on to the early nourishment in that community, but always a desire to also give back. And so that is what is a sort of ultimate motivation for me to continue to heal communities.
Mhm. Thank you, George. Your experience near just hearing kind of what you've walked through in the journey and how you're integrating hope and generosity is really touching to me. So thank you for being here. Peter, how
Yeah.
about you? Oh, I'm sorry, George, did you have?
No, no, I wanted to thank you for providing this opportunity. You reached out to me and it was like, just the right thing to do at this point.
Peter, how about for you? Well, I want to say something about why I reached out to you in I think, uh, our collegial and friendship relationship. You have been someone who's exquisitely attuned to me, to the experience of affect and emotion. And I think have played a role in kind of organizing experience in such um, a way that helps me feel more into what I'm experiencing and what I need. And so selfishly, I think this whole conversation in some way has been about trying to bear my own helplessness and find out, all the different facets of what I bump up against moment to moment, day to day, as different realities change, as we're another week out of our house or another friend or, guilt, and then expansiveness, how we kind of manage all of these shifting realities. And so, selfishly, I wanted to hear your eloquent way of organizing these experiences. So, Peter.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Michelle. That's very sweet and moving. And you actually raised in my thinking another reason that I wanted to participate. First of all, to your original question, why did we feel compelled just for the just to play off of the literal meaning that that can have. I didn't feel compelled at all. My joining you in this felt exquisitely full of choice and desire and freedom to do it or not do it. But and one of the reasons I realize as you say this is that and this is sort of a theme that I think reverberates both through my thinking at large, but particularly to draw on your word idiosyncratic. I think in certain idiosyncratic ways with this collective trauma, the whole business of finding relationship connections that can make a home for painful emotional experiences. And I think to what you said, I realize that I, like you, feel a bond with you. And I think when you put this out there, both generally and put it to me as an invitation, I heard it as kind of a sibling traumatized soul, as I do with a lot of my friends and colleagues, who's reaching out to find a home. And I think of you as doing that with a lot of the programming. You know, you're quite a brilliant programmer, as people that are at ICP know, but I think a lot of that is you reaching out for connections in experience. In this case, it sounds like the powerlessness. And so I think I really heard that. And I join as a friend, as a fellow trauma baby in a sense, who in particular, and maybe some of us in this group share this more than others. I mean, part of my personal story is being in traumatic loss. And a lot of people think of me as a lost baby, but what I really am a lost baby who couldn't find a home for the loss, in my language, my intersubjective systems language, who couldn't find receptive, responsive, understanding, emotional, embodied presence to it. So there's that. Then also, very importantly, and what I later say a couple words about, is I found that there's some very idiosyncratic, very acute and distinctive little, what I'm going to call witness depressions I've experienced with patients of mine, where their experience of this traumatic destruction, and I'm in West LA, so I'm mostly seeing people that have been exposed to the Palisades fire. We've had a multiplicity of them. And what I find with these, in my sort of emergent explanation, is these are people for whom, for idiosyncratic, particular ways, they can't find a home for how powerfully they've been impacted. And unlike George, I'm going to kind of focus on people in a particular stance we might call witness, who are some degree removed, like they haven't lost a house, but they're nevertheless exposed to this. So I want to do it because I see there's an acute need for home among my patient group. And then I think among all of us colleagues, right? You have had very close connection to the Altadena. George, Cheryl Goldstein, Scott, and Joy, and others in our family that are dealing with this. And I think also our colleagues at a distance who are more affected than maybe is allowed. So I hear this as embracing making a home. I want more of it. And selfishly, I need it. I've really felt this deeply, and I feel the need, and I'm very happy to be here helping to co-create this with you.
Thank you. I think you both are already helping me kind of move closer to and give myself room for the various feelings, that I have. And yeah, yeah. I also just want to speak to, I'm bumping up against my own self and process here. Like, I think there's something about that feels real and important. Like, I feel on the edge of language a bit with this living through. But one of the things I'm hearing or I'm curious about is trauma begets trauma, of how, our own, I hear you talking about Peter, and George, you referenced a bit too, in the way that growing up in Harlem and a parallel process. And I'm just wondering about how, living through a collective trauma, I think, activates so much more than just what's happening in this moment. And maybe you both could speak to that in different ways.
Yeah, it's the problem of memory. It's human memory. I was talking to someone recently uh, about what we did after World War One, which was disastrous. We were the winners, and we created conditions that created the Nazi regime. We learned more after World War Two, so there's always a divergence. What do you do with these tragedies? What do you learn from them, and how to use memory? It's extraordinary. I've been through so much that I was able to remind my daughters, we will rebuild. You can hold on to a faith and a vision that you will rebuild slowly and sometimes painfully. And I think something you contributed, Peter, is important. This idea of a witness depression. So I've been very moved by people wanting to help. And we had to have a family meeting to decide whether we would set up a GoFundMe campaign. And my great niece and her friend wanted to set that up. My wife was reluctant. We had a meeting that included our hostess here, as really part of the family, essentially. And we realized that we were adding to the pain of others who wanted to help by not giving them that opportunity. Uh, that others are aching with that pain, Peter, that you've identified. I've actually published on this using social dreaming, how there sometimes is a resistance to witnessing. It's too painful to resonate with the trauma of others. And sometimes we want to keep it at the individual level and not see we're all part of it, that we're all complicit. Uh, all of these things that happen to us collectively. The other response I had to our family meeting was, I have no problem receiving because all I do is pay it forward. So it all goes through me to others. So it's this incredible positive cycle of being nourished and nourishing others that I feel a part of.
Well, one thought I have on that, if I can throw it in, George, is I have a fantasy that you're talking about the importance I think you see in allowing others to give and to help. You spoke in our pre-conversation about it being sort of genuine philanthropic. But I wonder also whether, in addition to that, there's a way of kind of siblinghood, a way of it being more mutual than just charitable. I
Hmm.
don't mean in a narcissistic way, but I think in a way that we
Hmm.
find when we feel a
Yeah,
companionship in finitude and in our pain. That's
right.
one thought. The other thought, when you say, it's no problem for me to accept because I pay it forward, and I wonder what it's like for you personally, and if there's any George history, whether what it's like to be the object of someone, you individually, not in this world of paying it forward, of others' love and affection and wish to be with you in your vulnerability.
Yeah, it's uh, potentially right the legacy of not having had that siblinghood, that dwelling with, that may keep you in isolation. And I was telling someone that also what nourishes me is the memories I carry of all the siblings I had in that home, all the friends and community that shared the celebrations and the memories. These are all with me. It does feel very painful to watch my wife feel that she lost her. She had an enormous legacy of art. She's very involved in the contemporary arts community. We have iconic artists work in our home. It's all gone.
Mm,
And her own legacy is a supporter of the arts. She was a founder some years back of the campaign for the really basically the liberation of art, when the right was trying to crush the expressions of many artists. She started a national campaign. This is a legacy that was in our home being prepared to be given to a university. It's all gone.
mm.
So very sad, very tragic. Um, so somehow, how do we hold on to and be nourished by those memories and share that? You're absolutely right, Peter. Uh, the staring at that, I watched one of my daughters whose home we were in having stomach pain, seemed incessant Tuesday evening. She was watching TV and she kept saying, Dad, I wish I could go out there and help. Uh, My youngest daughter was sobbing inconsolably. She had felt she had lost her childhood home. My wife had heart palpitations. It was extraordinary to watch each of them just have extraordinarily painful symptoms. We recovered. We had each other. Um, I think you put your finger on it, Peter. It's that being able to feel that others are with you, resonating, that it will save us all. I've written on this, I've published on this in terms of climate change. I have a deep, powerful respect for sharing dreams together where we can build community through really being in touch with the social unconscious that we're all embedded in. Um, Extraordinary sense of community and the witnessing that can go on and sharing dreams with each other's suffering, which is actually collective suffering.
That, George, what you're talking about is making me think of, I like how you said our pre-meet, where Peter, you told this story. It maps onto an aspect of experience I've had in these moments where it feels like the veil is dropped, and I have these um, connecting points with another person that feels so expansive and deep. Like it's unlike it feels like a rarity. And Peter, you had told this story, I'll let you tell it, but about the man who was asked how does he feel after his house burned down. And I think you did we lose Peter? I think we lost Peter. That's interesting. Lauren, will you watch for if he comes back? Um, but what the punchline is this man was being interviewed after his house just burned down, and he said, "How do you feel?" And expecting devastation and shattering, and what he said was exhilarating, which is such an odd, feeling that feels that contrast. But I think there's something in the way that not to dismiss the depth of sorrow and grief, but something else lives alongside that in the capacity to participate with each other, in or recover our humanity through connecting through suffering and supporting one another.
Yeah. I immediately had three self states. One was a profound sorrow that so spontaneously crying and heading back to my daughter's home. But the other one was, of course, extraordinary disbelief that this hasn't really happened. This has to be undone. And then this vision of the future where I am imagining building my home in exactly the same place with enormous support from others, and the creativity of architects and those who have learned about fires. And that has been really, and as I can understand that exhilaration of, my God, there's a future here that I can create, and I can take vital lessons from this experience. The
You're
finding of objects in the debris has been a really interesting family experience. I'm tempted to send you guys a photo. It's in the New York Times, by the way. So photo, it may have been yesterday's New York Times. There are several people in white hazmat outfits. Those are my daughters.
Mm.
Yeah, with respirators. They're going through debris, and they discovered extraordinary things. There was a small Buddha we had in our backyard that survived. And they found silverware from their grandmother. Very expensive silverware that was an inheritance. And a very large, my wife is Jewish, and a very large dish shaped like a fish that was a gift from the grandfather that we would use during our seders. It's extraordinary. I can't imagine being there yet. I mean, I was so stunned at their courage and their ability to do that, and their preparedness to do that. It's extraordinary.
Michelle, do you see me now or not?
I do see you. We're playing a
Okay.
little peekaboo.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I do.
Sorry about that.
I was part part of part of the idea of this program is I think the different locations we sit and Peter, I think when you said witness depression, I wanted to try to elucidate or elaborate I think the experience and maybe dislocation is the word of what it feels like to bear an experience like this, and but at a distance. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I can try. I think maybe what I'd begin with is just what I've found to be really distinctive, striking sort of clinical material, which is essentially a handful of patients that I've seen through. I kept meeting through the week that the Pali fire basically started on a Tuesday, and it didn't really interrupt my being available. I had some people cancel, but in any event, I've seen a bunch of people through this, so I've seen a distinctive phenomenon of a number of folks who live in the West LA area who have not, like George and his family, been direct objects of the Pali fire in terms of losing houses, but are at varying different degrees. And I think that's something in here. You have people coming from all sorts of perspectives. I've got patients who didn't lose a house, but their sister did, and they've come to live with them. And all the way back to myself, for example, I'm in an office on the third story of an office building on Wilshire, has an outdoor patio facing north. So I have a big horizon of the Pali and the Santa Monica Mountains from which I watched the blazes, but I'm not seeing what's happening on the ground directly. I'm, like everyone else, seeing it through devices. So in any event, imagine an array, but what I'd like to talk about are people who are some degree or other sort of at a distance from like how George has lived through this and others who are right in the battlefield of it. And what I found is that there are two things. They're profoundly affected. And secondly, that there are these, what I'm calling witness depressions, where the emotional impact, the depressive feelings, say, whether it's heartbreak, anxiety, horror, grief, powerlessness, can't find a home in the sense that we're talking about. And it's been really striking. And it shows up with people apologizing for being essentially for being so profoundly impacted, feeling guilt for wanting to make time with me in their session or otherwise, that they're filled with these intense feelings that can be immobilizing to them. Speaking of which, I myself, on the weekend after the fires started, I went into my office and I was basically immobilized through the weekend. I was trying to do work on our conference and other things, and I ended up essentially sort of in a quasi paralyzed emotional state. And what I've been doing in part to try to resuscitate myself, but I think also because I felt a real identification with these patients, is to wonder what is this impact and why is it having such a hard time? And I had a couple thoughts about it. One is that this notion of witness that I think comes to mind, this business of are you directly or are you indirectly, I think loops back to invalidate the impact of those of us who might otherwise be characterized as witness. And it makes me wonder, what is it about this particular trauma or our situatedness that might yield it? And one thought is to go back to what George was talking about all the legacies that were destroyed in his house fire. Well, it really was evocative, just thinking about the profundity of history and of life, love that's given, that's burned to the ground, the girl's history, his daughter's history. But this same destruction of life world and of home, because relatively speaking, has been fairly limited loss of life given the magnitude of the destruction. There's this destruction of home, of life worlds, but this extends out to neighborhoods, to communities. Palisades Village is like a private Nagasaki up there. All the schools, the churches, the history of where parks and kids played and so forth. So I think part of my thought on this, and I'd like to hear others' thoughts, is that part of what is traumatized, if we think of one form of trauma, as Stollerow talks about the shattering of the absolutisms of everyday life, or the shattering of our sort of sustaining sort of developmentally sustaining or defensive illusions. I think the experience of the sustaining invulnerability, those illusions that help us with the exquisite existential vulnerability, in this case, not just of ourselves personally and our loved ones, but of our worldhood, of our communities. I think this has been completely decimated. And my one private theory is that these so-called witnesses are much more embedded in this world. They are part of it, even if they didn't lose a house, right? Especially the closer you are. Even I and Mary have a daughter who used to go to gym class up in Palisades, and I'd drop her off and go to the B of A and the Starbucks across the street, all ground leveled, right? So, so there's that. There's this idea that we may not be as much witnesses as we are, yet if we come into our experiences with this sort of language game of separation, like Cartesian separation, that it loops back to invalidate the validity of the massive impact. So a couple other quick thoughts on this that I think this would be an example of the kind of thing that makes painful affect traumatically unbearable, right? So a sort of metaphysic of separateness that lends to this idea of witness arguably doesn't apply with this kind of trauma that, as an op-ed person said very poignantly, when it comes to the people like George who've lost houses, the apocalypse has already arrived. Subjectively, I think it's an apocalyptic state. The other thought I wanted to tap into was metaphysic of witnesshood. I also think that that our culture of journalism feels an obligation to throw out all this sort of perceptual cognitive data of what's going on is relatively devoid of any sense of the emotional impact on people of these kinds of things. So these cultural organizers that are sort of don't have in them or oppose the idea of the validity of how profoundly emotionally impacted you are, I think would be one source of creating witness depression, right? It's obstructing the sense of validity that allows us to integrate into our sense of being in the world. Last thought, to riff off of what George alluded to earlier, is the intersection of our own personal histories and our personal traumas. And so, and this brings feelings to me. I didn't know what was going on for me. I was so crushed in this. And I realized all of a sudden in the middle of the night that I have a brother who's up in Palisades. And I'm not in touch with him really, but I was very concerned about he and his family. They're up in Palisades Highland. And I realized that standing on my perch on the third floor of my building, looking at these fires and worried about a family member was a direct structural analog to my original trauma, if you will, where I'm standing on the side of a tennis court on Cape Cod and I witnessed my father die in front of me. I'm completely helpless. It's a complete crashing of world. And then, as I alluded earlier, the story for me is one where that loss couldn't find a home. It couldn't because of in my family, the maternal side, and various reasons that basically subverted the ability for my mother and my family to really be a home to write this kind of traumatic experience. Well, it's replicated in things like, the illusion of witnesshood in a trauma like this. It's replicated in the indifference to affectivity that we see in our journalism as it bombards us with these images. And so what I would propose to all of us is to think, because I think there's probably a lot of different, whether they're cultural or other forms of diminishing the radical impact, maybe especially deriving from apocalyptic types of trauma like this on people that are obstructing, including with their own personal traumas. I had one patient that I have in mind about witness trauma where you wouldn't think of her as someone who has difficulty talking about her emotional experience. She's very, open and so on, but she was crushed down in one of these acute depressive states. And, I saw she was having trouble with this. I was sort of identifying, thinking, is this what I'm going through. And as we left the office, I said to her, sort of, in my psychoanalytic nonchalant, not thinking this was some big interpretation, I said, I can see you're having a really hard time to find a home for these feelings. She's an insurance patient I see once a week. I said, if you feel like for the next few weeks, it might be useful for us to meet an extra time, let's do it. Well, she burst into tears. And I was, oh, wow. And I said, well, there you have it. The thought of me inviting you in for us to pay attention and that it might be something I not only see, but am willing to get close to is like unimaginable to you in this moment, which, then she bursts into tears again. So those are my thoughts. Cultural, personal organizers that obstruct the experience. In this case, I'm talking about people in a particular class that fall into a few degrees removed from George, but I think it's a real thing. And last thought is, I've had people reaching out, we have in our community from China. I'd be really interested whether any of this thinking applies to folks, across the country or the globe who have experiences that may resonate or not with this phenomenon I'm trying to unfold.
I touch on so many things, Peter. Well, I happen to actually supervise and treat people in China. And one of the supervisors said, "My God, George, I mean, he was trying to express the unreality for him. I can't believe this is happening to you. I've known you for 3 years. I can't believe this is happening to you." So there is a distancing that people have to do to manage the painful things that are evoked in them. I've experienced different types of that, Peter. My most negative reaction has been to people who are trying to tell me what I should be feeling. You
Really?
know,
Why do you
yeah.
react negatively to that, George?
They have a formula about how I'm supposed to manage the trauma, and I'm going, fuck you. I have my own language for this and my own experience. And then I have patients who are very wealthy and lost their homes in the Palisades, and they're struggling with wealth guilt because they
Uh,
have enormous insurance and they're doing very well. Uh, but they're struggling with their own sense of guilt and trying to figure out how do I quantify what I have versus what other people have. It is all over the map. Sadly, even my hostess here, when we arrived, I was so grateful. I just wanted to grab her and kiss her. Uh, and my daughters saw me do that and they went into tears. But then my hostess went into explaining the trauma for them. I thought, no, 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 please. Uh, so it's hard for people to listen without premature formulations, uh, lots of words and theories. Yeah.
So much is being evoked for me. One being, a piece I bumped up against a number of times, and I'm relating to Peter, the permission to allow my heart to break in the
Yes,
specific way that it is,
absolutely, absolutely.
and all of the internal barriers, whether it's guilt or allowing myself to, yeah, to feel into the depth of sorrow I feel, I think disconnects me from actually participating in the nourishment, receiving and giving. I think that there's something of that dislocation. Um,
Well, I
yeah,
think you experienced it earlier, Michelle. You were at a loss for words. And that I've experienced from people. It seems like a really genuine, authentic loss for words. I don't know. But you feel the resonance. I mean, I'm convinced our limbic systems are designed evolutionarily to resonate with each other, unless you defensively block it. You know? Yeah.
well, speaking of defensive blocking, um, going back to this notion of witness and how it, in a sense, is a so-called metaphysical illusion that for the person who is feeling traumatized and who longs for a home, longs to connect and to see and integrate, it's an obstruction. But that's not everybody. there are those for whom the metaphysic of witness is a very appealing way of reinstituting or reinforcing already existing, I think, kind of defensive illusions that they're
Mm.
more separate than they think, I mean, they're more embedded than
That's
they
right.
think they are. And I think we see that, at a high level in climate change denial, all the way down, I think, here, maybe even to your hostess, who, in her love for you guys, may nevertheless, for
Hmm.
various reasons, need to step back and, be an expert, or,
Hmm.
as you
Right.
see out of Washington, the
Mm.
blame game. I think all these things are ways of distancing,
Mhm.
and that's by the way, I think that among those of us who are deeply affected by it, and I think maybe as a general statement in trauma work, you know, you, and I think Kohut said something like this, if you're needing and wanting a home for your affect, and some people need and want a home for affect, even though they don't think about it that way, in a sense, you need to exercise your agency. Not all relational contexts are receptive, and I recommend trusting one's intuition about that,
Mm.
and not trying to squeeze water from a stone. Just as a but defensive flight. We're familiar with that too.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
I think, by the way, another feature of, I think, some of the patients I've seen is that there's you're deeply affected, and then on various levels, again, culturally and otherwise, and even in one's own personal system, there may be a kind of ebbing and flowing, what people euphemistically call the return to normalcy. And I think that can be another odds that, we linger in our trauma states, even as our system may, on some level, pre-reflectively, or our community may wish to return to reinstall these sort of illusions and our so-called normalcy. One last interesting little piece of phenomenology that struck me is that, again, return to my patio looking north at the hills of Pali, right? And a week after, 10 days after the fire, all of a sudden it's a beautiful, sunny, clear, relatively clear sky day in Santa Monica. And you'll hear a lot of people talk about the surrealness. I'm looking out at the scene that was on fire a week ago,
Hmm. Yeah.
and it's a beautiful day, yet a stone's throw away, I know intellectually that it's a private Nagasaki up there in right. But what I mean to get at is that even perceptually, just that geographic thing happening, right? The clearing of the skies so that my perspective is suddenly drenched in beautiful, pristine, paradise like Santa Monica is at odds with my trauma state. And I felt it. I felt like this is surreal, but it's also like a weird at oddsness with my emotional state, and I think my patients too.
It's interesting. The photo I wanted to send to you guys, I have a private one with one of my daughters at the center and another one to the right. The one that's in the New York Times seems to be from above. And so the one I have from them has a beautiful blue sky with the sun. Uh, and it's all this debris, and the only thing that's standing is the chimney. Uh, it's extraordinary. But I've been thinking about our relationship to objects and how objects are evocative and contain all these meanings for us. And so, what were my daughters looking for? Uh, uh, I'm not there yet. I don't know what I'll do when I go there. Um, we I've come to the view that we human beings need to externalize our inner experience all the time. Everything, whether it's poetry, plays, art, you name it. The ownership of a nice jacket expresses some part of our soul, essentially. So these objects are so meaningful to us. It's extraordinary the place I've had to arrive in both owning that meaning and also letting go of it.
Mm.
I'm I'm thinking well, I'm thinking about in just a couple of minutes, I'd love to open to the audience questions or experiences you want to share. So if you are wanting to share, you're welcome to put it in the messaging, the chat, or you can raise your hand. I'd love for this to be an informal experience near, just an opportunity for us to all connect. In conversation today. So we'll open that up in just a minute. What did Steve say? Um, yeah. One of the ideas that was coming to me that I'm thinking about is Peter and I are on a committee for the Self-Site conference that's coming to Pasadena in 2025. And this all of this in the context of the fires and the intertwine of our theme that we're working on. But Simone Driscoll sent me one of her papers on vulnerability. But she in it she talked about cultivating the capacity for endurance. And I'm just thinking about that edge of bearing an authentic conversation with myself without falling, Peter, into what you're saying of like moving towards false illusions or premature closure, right? In my attempt towards meaning making, but kind of trying to bear this and live this and then live this with others, you know? And I think how we I'm using the word how, but I'm not really reaching for something didactic, but I'm trying to think about and feel into how I bear this and stay awake to what is emerging. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, endurance.
Wait, can you restate, Michelle, say again, are you musing about how you can better make a home for yourself or others? Am I pigeonholing this too into that metaphor? What are you, and
Yeah,
the
I mean, I think
endurability?
how we can be with ourselves and bear our vulnerability um, without, I think, moving to false tropes or, kind of pre-packaged niceties. That's an oversimplification, but I think just the different ways we can be with ourselves and bearing overwhelm and anxiety that comes with collective trauma. And I don't know if that question is maybe a little too uh, abstract, but does that make
Well, I
sense?
know yeah, it makes perfect sense. I mean, at a high level, I think this is what, in my lexicon of people I read, what Winnicott has in mind with holding, like what does that really entail in any given context? What would it look like? I think as therapists, we're sort of artists in this. We feel our way into what does it mean, and trial and error as to what seems to be connecting and in some way integrating a person's affect or our own. Stallero and Atwood write about dwelling as, their way of thinking about it. But I know with myself, like what's evolved in my own personal process with whether it's with my own emotional experience or really in my work, there's something I think I've come to trust my intuition in a sense about what feels genuine. I sort of can feel when I'm evading or when I feel closer to. I think that's one thing. Um, Another one that's sort of related, I don't know, I think it's related. I was thinking about language. I find in my own language and others, I hear something that how we symbolize our emotional experience can kind of tell you things. I know, for example, one thing I was going to mention that there's a lot of language, for example, that I find jarring in and around this trauma that the jarringness tells me it's pushing at least my experience away. And I feel like I learned something from that. For example, as well-meaning as people are, when people say, "Well, are you and Isabel and Mary okay? You know, is you and your family okay in body?" That's what really matters here. And of course, that's true on a certain level, but it's like that comes in as a concern, and then it feels like it's accompanied by a retreat. So maybe it isn't just about language, but it feels jarring to me because it's kind of zeroing in on what's important. And so there's something about being open to what may be important that doesn't register for us, whether in our own or particularly our patient's experience. So I guess an openness comes to mind, you know, let our patient's experience come and talk to us, maybe.
I'm noticing we have quite a few questions, so I want to open the audience. Sarah, do you want to start?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, guys. I feel very, very, very moved. I'm zooming in from New York, where it's freezing, not fire hot. And caveat is that I've taken a lot of notes because I've had so many thoughts and feelings throughout this, which are totally now disorganized because there have been so many, and because I do feel quite helpless from far away, not just about this situation, but the many other situations that are happening in the world. The thing that kept popping out to me, that feels really relevant to our work is, I think, something that George, you brought up, the difference between charitable and mutual, or charitability and mutuality. And that ties into an earlier thing. I can't remember who said trauma begets trauma. That may have been you too, George, but that
I think it was Peter. Yeah.
Peter, trauma
I
begets.
think it was Michelle, but anyway, go ahead.
Well, you three have been in a good combo. What I thought you were describing, all of you, was how collective suffering begets collective healing.
Mhm.
And yet there is a difference between charitability and mutuality. And I wonder if some of what Peter, especially you, are bringing up in terms of trauma witness is the difference between feeling like you're the hierarchy in charitability versus the level in mutuality. And mutuality is a very different affective experience. And maybe, Michelle, when you were talking about the exhilaration of survival in the context of mutuality, there's a little bit of a different affective experience when you're really in it versus when you're really not, but you're doing the best you can. And anyway, that feels very relevant to this current context and to our work. So I was curious to hear what you guys and other people in this room, Zoom room, think about that.
Sarah, can you just say a little bit more about, because by the way, I got cut off for a couple minutes, and maybe you're also alluding to something that I didn't hear, but about mutuality, for example, would the type of mutuality you're talking about partly be one instance of it might be the extent to which we might be able to be so-called siblings in darkness, like identify with, share in on certain dimensions. Like what? Can say more about what you're getting at?
I'm so glad you asked that, Peter, because I was also, yes, exactly that some sort of we're in this together dimension, but that doesn't mean that that the experience in its entirety is going to be identical.
Of course,
So,
right.
right. But the part of empathizing is finding the mutual analogs we have in our own trauma memories, George, and trauma experiences that resonate with how we understand what our patient may be going through, not because we need to be identical, but because there's something that gives you the feeling that, oh, I know what it's like to be in this boat. And
Mm-hmm.
that feels very different than throwing money at the boat
Mm-hmm.
to bail it out or something. I mean, that's crude, but
Mm-hmm.
you don't
Well,
have to, I don't have to be in LA to imagine my way into a nightmare. I know I can't fully imagine what it would be like to walk down my street.
right,
And I can't fully.
right. Well, I think there's something like even in my personal experience with you, Sarah, that goes to this that, I think you're someone who can really, you reach out to find analogs and to anticipate ways that you may be able to empathically understand. But, you're also someone who is very open to owning your own difference and distance whereby you may not know. So, like, for example, as a friend and colleague, I experience you as very open and inquisitive about what's your experience, sort of simultaneously in this mutual sphere, as I think there's a sense that where there's connection and identification, empathy to be had, it can come together. But it's a process of sort of building understanding. But I think also, as you know, I've been interested holding when one can't and when something's out of the
Yes,
range
true.
and not requiring, I think we all know that. I find this often when I'm in some painful experience, trying to share it with someone who isn't an expert analyst like us, who feels a kind of sort of narcissistic need to already know. And maybe George, this is a little bit like you. They don't only need to know, they need to curate how you experience your
Could
trauma so
be.
that it's not distant, different, right? And I think that comes out of a intolerance of affect. So maybe that's the answer, Sarah, is you're talking about the importance of affect tolerance, in particular
Mm,
uncertainty, even as you're empathically connecting
That's
and
lovely,
knowing.
Peter.
beautiful. I'm
Yes.
I'm noticing we have a lot of questions in the queue. Thank you, Sarah. That was really lovely. Eileen, do you want to turn on your mic?
Yes. Hi.
Hi.
Um, well, first of all, I just want to thank you, Michelle, for doing this. I'm in Northern California, as you know, but I've been deeply touched. I grew up in LA, not far from the Palisades. One of my closest friends, Cheryl, lost everything. But I want to speak to this coming on top of the inauguration of Donald Trump. And I feel such a profound sense of loss of democracy, loss of Los Angeles, loss of my friend's home that I used to stay in a lot when I went to ICP. And I think what you guys are doing, we're going to have to do a lot of in the future because the theme of this is relationship and mutuality, and we frankly need organizers to be able to facilitate this for our coming together. And I think we're all going to have to think of ways going through to the future, given the political landscape, given the climate catastrophe that's going on all over the place. So this is just a big thank you for providing something that I think we're all going to need in the future.
You, Eileen.
Eileen, I think, thank you, and I concur with you, and I really feel strongly that these kinds of gatherings and our various conferences and everything, I always think of them as really, in part, efforts to make home for our experiences, even if we may theorize and all that. But I hear you, but I and concur, but I am particularly responding to the sort of coexisting traumas that are experienced with, the election and the inauguration, and then this trauma. And one that comes to mind on top of the loss, and I wonder what you think about it, is that, you know, immediately in this divisive, sort of horrifying partisan political rhetoric and this, that, the other, and this shift of power, where one of my experiences with Trump coming to power is to realize how, boy, who is in a position to call the narrative and the truth? I really feel like this shift. And then in the context to be in this trauma in LA,
Right.
and to see it be a political opportunity
Right.
to have a story start to be told, I find to be so disorganized. I mean, it's of course offensive, and we can blah blah blah, but it's also like deeply erodes a sense of validity. I don't know about you, but I really feel, even though I
Yeah.
have my ideals and convictions, that when Trump and all his, and sorry to those who are Trump supporters, but this is my experience, when that narrative comes in, even with my convictions, there's this kind of grinding corrosion to my sense of validity about my liberal values, right? It's like when Larry Flint is elected to the Popehood, as David Brooks put it once, and I just feel like if you now think about how you're experiencing this loss and destruction, and you got people coming in and saying, oh, this is, applying this narrative, talk about subverting a relational home, right? On a level I don't know what you'd call that. That's a level that's, not just a familial, personal, dyadic,
Right. Right.
intense.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Quite sadly and traumatically, uh, we have people supporting this regime that actually control those organs, which cultural collective narratives are disseminated. We're really at risk. We need counter narratives. We need to find ways to do that.
Yeah.
Do
Yeah.
you have a name for that, George, or Eileen? I could sort of imagine something like the national language. You said cultural narrative, but it's
Counter
like,
narrative. Counter narrative.
Counter narrative.
well,
Yeah.
the
Is we
counter
need,
narrative, but I'm just saying that when you hear it coming out of DC, it feels like someone's calling the shot of what the narrative is, and it's a different dimension of language or something, a collective language.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, it is. It is.
I want a
People
name
have.
for it.
Yeah, well, that's the challenge. We need to find a language for what we're experiencing. Uh, and that's part of the healing, formulating a language that truly resonates with the affective experience. That's where the hollowness can enter with the journalism we're seeing. I've been reading Hannah Arendt. I've been writing a paper most of the summer to be published in the International Journal of Applied Psychoanalysis. And an essay she wrote on truth and its importance in politics is mind-blowing. She was writing as if she were an analyst. Many neo-Kleinians, particularly Dion, believe that this was a third drive in human beings, the need for truth and real genuine affective knowledge.
Mm. Haley, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I just to echo everyone, I'm very appreciative of this space, and really what I wanted to comment on is just my personal anxiety and how rampant that has been, um and just my how it's affected me in working with clients, and has brought up pretty similar feelings for myself, but also for bunch of my clients were the ones that brought it up first, but the parallels between this uh anxiety that we're feeling now versus when we were feeling it in 2020. And I'm an associate, and in 2020, I was in grad school. I was in class with you, George, and hi. And now I'm here, and it feels, um, yeah, just like a real, like this. I work with children, and um, I had a 10-year-old come in, and he was just really distraught, had to evacuate, and he spoke. I'm so appreciative of the language, Peter, the witnessing depression, just to the witnessing. Um, there's something going on in his school right now where if your house wasn't directly affected, you are like ostracized, basically, or you are not
You don't
allowed.
count.
Yeah, you're not allowed to have feelings about it. And
Yeah.
so he's coming in, he's like a deeply sensitive child, um,
hmm
but also just like a feeling person. And he is he's so upset, and he's like, I'm hurt, I'm sad, I'm scared, my house is fine, but where can I, like, I have feelings about this too, and I'm trying to process, me as Haley, I'm trying to process all of this as an adult. And I'm like, I don't know how to help you, little boy.
Haley,
Um,
I have a thought that came to my mind with your patient. What's his first name?
um,
Joey.
Tony. I
yeah,
I
Tony.
imagine I imagine at that moment saying to Tony sort of playfully, "What's it like to feel sad and anxious and disempowered, but sadly to be disqualified from having those feelings?" That's what I might say.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a sad. I don't know what to make of it. This morning I was teaching a class. It's very sustaining for me to return to routine in some ways. And the class is on community psychoanalysis. And we were talking about human subgrouping. Uh, I think most of you have noticed that we have about 200 armed nations. Within those nations, there are probably 50 groups vying for nationhood. We are designed for subgrouping. So what came up in our discussion was, well, what's the positives of subgrouping? Because it really hurts people to be excluded. It's an extraordinary, horrific, painful phenomenon of clicking, uh, pushing others out, having, quote, boundaries against aliens and invaders who will rape your women and so on. It just goes on and on. It's extraordinary. I think psychoanalysis has failed us in that, and really practice and theory around our just human tribalism. We see it with our children, for sure.
Thank you, George. Mark, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, it's not actually a question. I've been, very lost and confused and lately, and I want to selfishly use this group because it's pulling me together really well, listening to you guys. Um, I okay, this is complexity. This is about enduring a little bit. I think that was Simone's paper you mentioned. Is that right? Endurance and the exquisite complexity of experience. On Tuesday, the fires broke out. On Sunday, I was with my mother while she died.
Oh,
And again, everybody has a reaction to it where I feel a little bit like George, like, wait, that's not my experience. But she was 94. She died quickly, which is what she wanted. I flew up from Guadalajara. I was with her the night before and the day. Everything went great. So now I'm in this empty house in St. Paul, Minnesota, filled with objects, all the photos, all the beloved stuff going back to ants from Sweden 100 years before, because they've been in this house forever. And I live in a place that should have burned. I'm right next to the reservoir where they're scooping up the water to drop it on the Palisades. So I've got the Watch Duty app on my phone, which just went off as we were talking.
Mhm.
And I'm in this house filled with stuff that I've got to get rid of, like I am
Mhm.
the fire or something. And
Mhm.
I just
Mhm.
talked with a friend whose house had burned down. We've spent lots of time with her kids. She had pictures of our kids there that she didn't think they would need, but then the house burned down. And I've been spending the last 2 weeks. I came back here getting ready to evacuate with the bag of stuff that my wife, who's in Mexico, said I should try to save. Didn't know whether to take, whether it's safer in the car or leaving it in the house. I left it in the house. Then I had to go back to Minnesota where I've been raising this house. We're selling it. We've got an estate sale people. We've donated stuff. I'm shipping things off to people all over the world, including England, so everybody has a little token. But I'm doing a weird version, parallel version of this thing that everybody had to do when they had to get out of their house, which I, in fact, was doing. Like, which do I want to
Mhm.
save? Car now, I
Mhm.
can replace it.
Mhm.
Um, but I'm actually emptying another house that's totally safe, except the person's dead. And I'm kind of doing this here because my own therapist died recently. I don't have to write
Mhm.
the person to process it.
Mhm.
Um,
Mm.
and I guess you guys can make sense out of all this, but I'm a little bit like Michelle at the beginning. I was pulled emotionally just to go there. And I hope I
Mhm.
haven't taken up too much time with it, but I think it works with the themes. Like, are you allowed to feel bad about this too, or take up all this space?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Mark, for sharing that.
It's so great to see you here, George, and to see, I
Yeah.
think Scott's here too, didn't, it's
Yes, Scott is here.
wonderful to have contact with people who got what is, I imagine, the worst of it. Yeah.
Well, Mark, one thing I hear in what you're talking about is you intersecting this world that experientially I think of as your life world, with your mom, of course, the centerpiece of anyone's life world, whatever our feelings about going back,
Mhm.
addressing a home. I don't know if you grew up there,
Mhm.
retrieving and distributing, artifacts that kind of symbolically hold. They're among like the legacies George was talking about that were lost. And then, thinking about uh, your own home and should have been lost. I just hear, and of course, you're part of this community and this whole worldhood that suffered such a trauma. So I don't know, my just initial thought is how you're wondering in part whether your experience of central loss and in the sense of life world in which there's an embeddedness in our own personal life worlds, but somehow that's part of a larger worldedness that's been invoked in this trauma. That's sort of where I hear you living and feeling somehow this
It, it,
sense of disqualification.
it was because, well, I don't know if I felt disqualified, but I had that uncanny lost spacey thing, watching all the
Mhm.
guy with the horns in the Capitol going free and saying, "Oh, great! I can't wait to do it again."
Mhm.
On top of everything else, there's just so much chaos and so little grounding that I
Mhm.
started to feel like I was floating almost.
Mhm.
And I came here because I know a lot of you people, and I know that you can hold.
Oh, well,
I mean,
George, I mean, Mark, one thing that quickly that came to mind, part of my reaction more specifically to the whole inauguration is something I described to a friend as epistemological strain.
yeah,
I didn't have a foundation to make sense. It was uprooting my
Mhm.
order of how I
I
make
couldn't go
sense of what
anywhere
I
near
hold to
it.
be true and real, and I didn't have a way to make sense of it. That felt
I,
unanchoring.
I couldn't even peek at it. I didn't.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
Anyway, thank you, Peter. Thank you, George. Thank you, Michelle.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Carol?
Thank you so much, Michelle, for organizing this. It's been such a needed and enriching and emotional experience to participate. I just wanted to share sort of a little bit of my experience living on the west side, but south of Santa Monica. So most people would say not a problem. But I remember Tuesday night with the fire raging in the Palisades, raging in Altadena, and then the Sunset Fire breaking out in the middle of Hollywood at the same time. And suddenly it was like, oh my God, talk about the absolutisms of everyday life being shattered. LA was no longer safe. It was like, no, it felt like nowhere in LA was actually, guaranteed anymore. And that was shattered. And then I think we're also talking about the overlapping shatter of the assumption of democracy in the United States. That suddenly, with Trump getting elected, taking office, being as brutal as he's being, and regarding California and its disaster, I think we're all dealing with these mutually shattering illusions, which is really just so shocking and overwhelming. So thank you for bringing that up because it so, yeah, summarizes.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Carol. Anna?
Hi, thank you so much for having this. I'm in Boston, so I'm on the other side of the country. But I grew up, I'm going to cry. I grew up in Malibu and Pacific Palisades. So on Tuesday, I texted my sister and said, there's a fire in the Palisades. And she said, I'm going home. I'm very frightened. And and then my mother, who's in Maine right now, who's 90, grew up in the Palisades. So I called her and I said, I want to talk to you before you see it on the news that the Palisades is burning down. And so she had all these memories of childhood and her elementary school and the loss of it was like she'd lost some part, like her childhood was burning or something. Anyways, so the whole week kind of was on the texting and checking what was burning. La Costa Beach burning down. I used to go there and play volleyball, and the beautiful ocean still lapping up on the shore with the sunlight. And then I have a client here who lives in Cambridge, and she grew up in LA. And so she came in on Thursday, and when she walked in the door, she burst into tears. And I then also had tears. And she talked about the feeling of guilt of being so far away, but having these strong feelings, and the feeling of losing something, watching Altadena burn for her, like that she was losing a part of herself, but it was really hard because she's here and safe. So I thank you for letting me share. That's just kind of what it's all been like, and for me in Boston. Yeah.
Well, Anna, if I can jump in, because I have a really
Yeah.
visceral response, is just your mother's experience feels so poignant. It really is another dimension of what I see, and I think I mean by this impact on the experience of worldhood over time, right? I mean, worlds are to be
Right.
the risk of being too physicalistic in time and space. The historicity of these communities, and you hear, with people and young people are in my practice talking about their childhood schools and so forth. But with your mom, it's illustrating the intergenerational depth of the loss. That's
Yeah.
just so incredibly poignant. And then you said something else, and now I'm spacing out on it. But thank you for sharing that.
One other just random coincidence, as I was asked to write a discussion to a paper that was published in Dialogues in December. And the entrance to the paper is me talking about my home in Malibu burning down a few years ago and watching it on the news. But that happened a few years ago, and it was just published in December. And then having this happen again. It's just kind of very.
Oh, can I just jump in once more? That this thought came that I want to share is you talked about your friend who, from a distance, felt that somehow her sense of self client. And it reminds me of, basically in our field, the so-called relational turn. And I think the reason why, at least on my corner of theorizing, that Heidegger's been so rich for Stahler-owned companies because we think about being in the world where phenomenologically the experience of selfhood, otherhood, and worldhood are of a unity. And if you get a significant loss in one dimension of that, you would predict that it may be felt very much in one's experience of self. So that really resonates that with this loss of world and historicity is a big swath of this person's sense of self in the world.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Peter. I'm
Thank you.
noticing, Marky, I know you've been waiting. Yeah.
Hi, thanks all for this really moving conversation. I just wanted to say, I've been thinking a lot about, George, you made reference to this, so I want to elaborate on what you talked about. I live in West LA. I actually saw the start of the fire. I was downstairs from Peter's office, so I saw the huge plume of smoke and thought, oh no, this is going to be bad. And I grew up in a community adjacent to Altadena, and I learned to swim in Eaton Canyon. So I felt connected to both communities and know how special they both are. My husband grew up in Pacific Palisades. Now, he hasn't lived there in 40 years, but he was bereft as well at the loss of that community. As I've been listening to two patients that lost their homes in the Palisades, it's really struck me about how in loss, there is also a sense of the loss of a future that one had imagined. One of my patients talked about how they were shopping for a home down the street from this house that he had built in the Palisades and loved because he wanted his grandchildren to be able to walk to his house. Now he's having to reimagine an entirely different future. Same with my other patient, in a different way. So I just wanted to highlight that piece of it that I hadn't thought of before this.
I really resonate with that because immediately beside my sorrow and disbelief was building continuity with myself, imagining a future. And I think Mark and Anna were alluding to the other end of that spectrum, right? The intergenerational sense of continuity and the objects that are so meaningful to my wife, her history, her life world. It's extraordinary. There was an imagined future there too, where her legacy would be at a university. It's extraordinary.
Well, I want to thank you all for being here. And I guess I just want to say what experientially I feel like I've gotten is the shyer and tenderer parts of me that needed to respond to the reach. I think, Mark, I'm going to just I'm just going to say it, how much we need each other to make sense, to find continuity, to find
Absolutely.
and sustain endurance. So thank you all for being a part of this. And we'll follow up with further resources and potentials of support. And with that, thank you. Thank you,
Thanks,
George
Michelle.
and Peter, as well.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Absolutely.
everyone.
Thank
Thank
you,
you, Peter.
Michelle.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah.
Thank you, George.
Okay.
Thank you
Goodbye
so
for now.
much. Please.
Thank you. Be well.
Thank you. Be well, everyone.
Does that work?
Yeah.
You.
Nice job, love. Did a real service.